We've all heard the fairy tales where the dangerous billionaire falls for the perfect slender supermodel. But what happens when the most feared man in Chicago's underworld makes the biggest mistake of his life by mocking the one woman who holds the key to his survival? Lorenzo Moretti built an empire on blood, fear, and intimidation, but a simple ledger brought him to his knees. He laughed at Beatrice Gallagher, dismissing her as a fat, pathetic joke. Months later, bleeding and desperate, she was the only person on earth he could turn to. This is a story of power, betrayal, and a very heavy dose of karma. The financial district of Chicago is a place where millions of dollars change hands in the blink of an eye. Hidden beneath layers of corporate jargon, offshore accounts, and perfectly tailored suits. Beatrice Gallagher understood this world better than anyone. At 28, she was the senior forensic accountant at Sterling & Hayes, a highly respected firm with an office overlooking the icy waters of Lake Michigan. Beatrice, known to her few friends as Bea, was brilliant. She could look at a spreadsheet of 10,000 rows and spot an anomaly in seconds. But in a world obsessed with appearances, her intellect was constantly overshadowed by her physical size. Bea was fat. She carried her weight with a quiet resignation, having spent her entire life enduring the side eyes, the unsolicited diet advice, and the blatant dismissals from men who look right through her. She dressed in conservative, dark, loose-fitting blazers and wide-legged trousers, armor designed to make her invisible. But numbers didn't judge. Numbers didn't care about the size of her waist. It was a cold Tuesday in November when the numbers stopped adding up. Bea was running a routine audit on a subsidiary of a massive logistics and real estate conglomerate, Apex Holdings. On paper, Apex was a legitimate titan of industry. In reality, as Bea was quickly discovering, it was a beautifully constructed washing machine for dirty money. She traced $14.5 million funneled through a concrete supplier, Lombardi Materials, right into a series of shell companies based in the Caymans. The money trail was sloppy, arrogant even. Whoever was running this didn't think anyone would be smart enough or brave enough to look closely. Bea brought the findings to her boss, Richard Hayes. Instead of praising her, the color drained from his face. "Do you have any idea whose account you're digging into, Beatrice?" Hayes whispered, his hands trembling as he closed her laptop. "That's Lorenzo Moretti's portfolio." Lorenzo Moretti, the name was whispered in Chicago with a mixture of reverence and absolute terror. He was 32, the heir to the Moretti crime syndicate. He had dragged his family's traditional Mafia operations into the modern era, swapping Tommy guns for high-frequency trading and corporate extortion. He was notoriously ruthless, strikingly handsome, and utterly unforgiving. "The numbers are wrong, Mr. Hayes," Bea said stubbornly, pushing her glasses up her nose. "There's a massive leak. Someone inside his organization is siphoning off millions and framing the tax burden on legitimate fronts. If the IRS audits this, it all falls apart. I have to present this to the client." Hayes refused, terrified for his life. But Bea's professional integrity, perhaps her only source of pride, wouldn't let it go. She insisted that as their accountant, it was her fiduciary duty to warn the client of internal embezzlement. After days of arguing, an unprecedented meeting was arranged. Bea was summoned to the Obsidian Club, Lorenzo Moretti's private, ultra-exclusive lounge in the Gold Coast. Walking into the club, Bea felt painfully out of place. The air was thick with the scent of expensive bourbon and Cuban cigars. The room was populated by men in bespoke Italian suits and women who looked like they had stepped off the runways of Milan, tall, impossibly thin, dripping in diamonds and designer silk. Bea touched her worn leather briefcase to her chest, her dark navy suit feeling cheap and overly warm. She was escorted to a private VIP booth in the back. There sat Lorenzo Moretti. He was leaning back in a plush leather booth, a glass of scotch in one hand, while a stunning, razor-thin blonde whispered in his ear. Lorenzo possessed a dark, lethal kind of beauty. Sharp jawline, piercing dark eyes, and an aura of absolute authority. Mr. Moretti, the heavy-set bodyguard, grunted. The accountant from Sterling and Hayes. Lorenzo didn't even look up at first. He took a slow sip of his drink. When he finally shifted his gaze to Bay, his eyes did a slow, sweeping assessment of her body. There was no attempt to hide his disdain. A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. This is the genius financial watchdog Hayes has been crying about? Lorenzo's voice was smooth, a dark velvet purr with a razor's edge. I was expecting someone sharper. I assure you, Mr. Moretti, in my mind is quite sharp, Bea said, her voice shaking slightly but holding firm. She placed her file on the table. I found a discrepancy in your logistics subsidiaries. Someone in your inner circle is embezzling roughly $2 million a quarter. Lorenzo leaned forward, ignoring the file. He looked at Bea, taking in her round face, her flushed cheeks, her sensible flats. He chuckled, a cruel, cold sound. And you figured this out, did you? Between trips to the bakery? The blonde next to him giggled. The bodyguard snickered. Bea felt a hot flush of humiliation burn from her neck up to her hairline. She was used to insults, but the sheer, effortless cruelty of this man stung in a way she hadn't anticipated. The numbers don't lie, Bea said, forcing herself not to look away even as her eyes prickled with tears. You have a rat, Mr. Moretti. The accounts tied to Leo Rossi are bleeding you dry. At the mention of his underboss and oldest friend, Leo Rossi, Lorenzo's amusement vanished. His face turned to stone. He stood up, towering over her. The threat radiating off him was palpable. Leo is blood, Lorenzo said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You come into my club looking like a melted candle and try to tell me how to run my family based on some spreadsheets you misread? You're a joke. I didn't misread anything, Bea whispered. Get her out of here. Lorenzo snapped at his guards, turning his back on her in ultimate dismissal. She's not my type, she's not my problem, and if she ever looks into my books again, I'll have her dropped in the river. Take your delusions and your appetite somewhere else. Bea was roughly escorted out of the club and shoved onto the cold Chicago pavement. She stood there under the flickering neon streetlights, clutching her briefcase, tears of rage and humiliation streaming down her face. She vowed right then and there she would never try to help a man like Lorenzo Moretti again. Let him rot. 6 months later, the rot finally consumed the empire. Lorenzo Moretti thought he was invincible. But arrogance is the heaviest blindfold. He had ignored Beatrice Gallagher's warning, believing a woman he found physically repulsive couldn't possibly possess the intellect to outsmart his carefully constructed network. It was the most catastrophic miscalculation of his life. It started raining on a Thursday night, a torrential, freezing Chicago downpour. Lorenzo was at his penthouse in the West Loop, reviewing a series of property acquisitions when the steel-reinforced doors of his foyer were blown off their hinges. Flashbangs blinded him, the deafening roar of FBI. Jet on the ground echoed through the marble halls. Lorenzo reacted with the instincts of the predator. He didn't freeze, he moved. He hit the hidden panel beneath his mahogany desk, dropping a tactical shotgun into his hands, and bolted for the panic room. But as he looked at the security monitors, his blood ran cold. It wasn't just the FBI. Moving alongside the SWAT teams were men he recognized, hitmen belonging to Victor Castelli, the head of the rival Russian-Italian coalition on the south side. This wasn't just a raid, it was an execution disguised as an arrest. And then Lorenzo saw the impossible on the camera feed. Standing in the hallway, directing the feds toward Lorenzo's hidden servers, was Leo Rossi, his right-hand man, his brother-in-arms. The accounts tied to Leo Rossi are bleeding you dry. The fat accountant's words echoed in his mind, hitting him harder than a physical blow. She had been right. Leo had been embezzling the money, but he hadn't just been stealing it. He had been using it to buy off the federal agents and fund Victor Castelli's takeover. Leo had framed Lorenzo for federal terrorism funding using the very shell companies Bea had tried to warn him about. Lorenzo had no time for regret. He engaged the penthouse's emergency escape chute, dropping into the service elevator shaft just as a hail of bullets shredded his office. He managed to slide down the cables, his hands tearing, blood soaking his expensive shirt. He burst into the underground parking garage only to find Costelli's men waiting. A brutal firefight ensued. Lorenzo was a master of survival, moving with lethal precision, dropping 3 men before taking a grazing bullet to his left shoulder and a deep slash across his ribs from a combat knife. Gasping for air, bleeding heavily, he managed to hotwire a nondescript cleaner's van and smash through the garage barricades, disappearing into the storm. By dawn, Lorenzo Moretti was a ghost. His bank accounts were frozen. His safe houses were compromised. His loyal men were either dead or arrested. The news channels were plastered with his mugshot, naming him public enemy number 1, wanted by the FBI for racketeering, money laundering and treason, and hunted by the cartel for a massive bounty. He was hiding in an abandoned warehouse in Cicero, shivering in the damp cold, clutching his bleeding side. He had nothing, no money, no power, no allies. Leo had locked him out of his own offshore crypto wallets. The only way Lorenzo could buy his way out of the city, hire a mercenary crew and take his revenge, was to access a hidden contingency fund of $150 million buried under layers of impenetrable corporate firewalls and biometric-locked algorithms. But Leo had changed the routing numbers. The money was trapped in a digital maze. Lorenzo was brilliant at violence and strategy, but he was no hacker. He needed a forensic accountant. He needed someone who could unweave a spider web of dummy corporations and offshore accounts without triggering the FBI's tripwires. He mentally scrolled through the list of every corrupt banker and mob accountant in his Rolodex. They were all either dead, flicked by the feds, or completely incapable of handling this level of complex digital forensics. Except for one, the woman who had seen the fatal flaw in his empire months before it collapsed. The woman who saw through the numbers like Neo seeing the Matrix. Beatrice Gallagher. Lorenzo closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the cold concrete wall. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. He had mocked her. He had stripped her of her dignity, laughed at her appearance, and thrown her out like garbage. Now his life, his fortune, and his vengeance rested entirely in her hands. He tore a piece of fabric from his ruined shirt, bound his bleeding ribs, and gripped his stolen pistol. He had to find her, and he had to pray she hadn't forgotten him. Beatrice Gallagher lived in a modest, heavily secured third-floor apartment in Oak Park. It was her sanctuary, a place where she could eat her favorite pasta without judgment, read her massive fantasy novels, and exist in peace. It was 2 a.m. on the Saturday. Bea was sitting on her plush sofa wrapped in a thick fleece blanket, nursing a mug of hot cocoa while reviewing a complex tax file for a new client. The news played softly in the background on her television. The anchor's voice droned on about the massive manhunt for Chicago crime boss Lorenzo Moretti. Bea watched his face flash on the screen. She felt a dark, vindictive spike of satisfaction. Good, she thought. I hope they catch him. I hope he rots. She had never forgotten the humiliation in the Velvet Room. It had taken her months to rebuild her shattered self-esteem after his brutal public mockery. Suddenly, a heavy, wet thud echoed from her fire escape. Bea froze. The mug stopped halfway to her mouth. She listened carefully. There was the sound of metal groaning, followed by the shattering of her kitchen window. Panic seized her. Bea wasn't an action hero. She was a deeply introverted accountant. She scrambled off the sofa, her heart hammering against her ribs, and sprinted toward her bedroom to grab her phone. Before she could dial 911, a massive shadow filled her hallway. A hand, wet with rain and blood, clamped over her mouth, pinning her against the wall. Bea screamed, but the sound was muffled against the rough leather of a glove. "Don't scream," a ragged, deep voice hissed in her ear. "If you scream, I have to kill you. Not if you understand." Trembling violently, tears welling in her eyes, Bea nodded. The hand slowly withdrew, Bea spun around, pressing her back against the wall, grabbing a heavy brass lamp from the console table and holding it up like a club. Standing before her, dripping wet, pale, and covered in blood, was Lorenzo Moretti. He looked nothing like the untouchable god of the underworld she had met 6 months ago. His bespoke suit was ruined, torn open to reveal a crude, blood-soaked bandage around his ribs. His face was bruised, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. He leaned heavily against the doorframe, a pistol dangling loosely in his right hand. "You," Bea gasped, her shock temporarily overriding her terror. "What are you doing here? The police are looking everywhere for you." "Not aware. Now, which is why I'm here," Lorenzo grunted, wincing as he took a step forward. He stumbled, collapsing heavily onto her pristine beige rug. The gun clattered out of his hand. Thea stared at him. The most dangerous man in Chicago was bleeding out on her living room floor. She could run, she could grab the gun. She could call the FBI and claim the massive reward. Lorenzo looked up at her, his dark eyes cloudy with pain, but the fierce intelligence within them was still burning. "I need your help, Beatrice," he rasped, coughing up a speck of blood. Bea slowly lowered the lamp. The fear was receding, replaced by a cold, sudden realization of the power dynamic. 6 months ago he held all the cards. He was the king, and she was the peasant. Now the king was begging in the dirt. "My help? My help?" Bea asked, her voice steadying. She crossed her arms, looking down at him. "Why would I help you? You're a criminal. You're a murderer, and as I recall, I'm just a melted candle who belongs in a bakery." Lorenzo flinched at his own words being thrown back at him. He let out a harsh, breathless laugh. "You hold a grudge. Good. That means you're smart. I told you 6 months ago I was smart, Mr. Moretti. You just couldn't see past my waistline to realize it." "I was blind," Lorenzo admitted, his voice tightening with pain. "Arrogant, and I paid for it. Leo betrayed me, exactly like you said he would." "I know. I've been watching the news," Bea said coldly. "And frankly, I think it's exactly what you deserve. Now get out of my apartment before I call the cops." The chamber. Lorenzo pushed himself up on one elbow. "Leo locked me out of the Cayman servers. He changed the algorithmic keys to my contingency fund. I have $150 million floating in the dark web, masked behind 70 shell corporations. The feds will find it in a week. Leo will find it in 3 days. I need it tonight." Bea's accountant brain, despite the surreal danger of the situation, immediately clicked into gear. 70 shell corporations, biometric-locked algorithms. It was the financial equivalent of cracking the Enigma code. It was the ultimate puzzle, and you think I can bypass it, she said softly. "I know you can," Lorenzo said, locking eyes with her. "You cracked my localized wash network in 2 days using standard audit software. If I give you the master root access, you can untangle the rest. You're the only person alive smart enough to do it, Beatrice." Bea looked at the bleeding Mafia boss. She thought about her miserable job at Sterling and Hayes, where she was overworked and underpaid. She thought about a lifetime of being overlooked. "What's in it for me?" she asked, her voice shocking herself with its steely resolve. Lorenzo raised an eyebrow, genuinely surprised by a lack of panic. "I don't kill you." "Not good enough," Bea said, stepping forward and taking his discarded pistol out of his reach. Lorenzo watched her, a flicker of genuine respect crossing his pain-filled face. "You brought a war to my doorstep. If I do this, I'm an accessory to federal treason. I'm risking my life, my freedom, and my CPA license." "What do you want?" Lorenzo asked. 20%, Bea said without missing a beat. $30 million, wired to an untraceable account of my choosing. And an apology. Lorenzo stared at her. The fat, quiet accountant he had mocked was currently extorting a mafia boss for $30 million. It was insane. It was magnificent. "You've got balls, Gallagher, I'll give you that," Lorenzo said, a bloody smirk forming on his lips. "Deal. 30 million. Now, get me a laptop. And maybe a towel." Bea didn't flinch. She walked into her bathroom, returning a moment later with a stack of dark towels and a heavy-duty first aid kit she kept for hiking trips. She tossed them onto the rug beside him. "Clean yourself up," she ordered, her tone devoid of any bedside manner. "If you bleed on my motherboard, the deal is off." Lorenzo let out a pained, breathy chuckle, pressing the towel against his ribs. He watched with a mixture of disbelief and fascination as Bea moved around the apartment. She didn't look like a woman who had just been cornered by a mafia boss. She walked with purpose, locking the deadbolts, drawing the heavy blackout curtains tight, and turning off the overhead lights. The only illumination came from the sudden cool blue glow of her massive custom-built computer rig, taking over the corner of the living room. 3 curved monitors hummed to life. Bea pulled her hair into a messy bun, secured it with a pencil, and dropped into her ergonomic leather chair. She cracked her knuckles. "Give me the root access codes," she demanded, not looking back at him. Lorenzo gritted his teeth, shifting his weight against the base of her sofa. He pulled a heavily encrypted burner smartphone from his ruined jacket and read off a string of alphanumeric sequences. Sparse fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, the rhythmic clacking filling the quiet apartment. "Leo is thorough," Lorenzo rasped, tying a bandage tight across his torso with shaking hands. He utilized a decentralized network. The funds bounced between Zurich, the Caymans, and a server farm in Belize every 60 seconds. If you input the wrong extraction key, the algorithm burns the accounts to ash. Everything goes to zero. "I know how a decentralized wash works, Mr. Moretti," Bea said coolly, her eyes darting across the cascading lines of data on her screens. "But Leo isn't an accountant, he's a thug playing with adult toys. He used standard corporate offshore routing. It's lazy." For the next 2 hours, the only sounds in the apartment were the storm raging outside and the relentless typing of Beatrice Gallagher. Lorenzo sat on the floor, fighting the creeping edge of unconsciousness, watching her. 6 months ago, he had barely looked at her. He had seen a heavy woman in a frumpy suit and dismissed her entirely, blinded by a lifetime of superficial standards. Now, bathed in the glow of the monitors, he saw her truly for the first time. Bea was in her element, an absolute apex predator in the digital financial jungle. Her dark eyes were sharp and focused. The soft curves of her face, which he had once mocked, now struck him as classic Renaissance-like beauty. There was a quiet, undeniable power in the way she commanded the machine, unraveling an international conspiracy that had baffled federal agencies. She was brilliant, and in that moment Lorenzo realized how terrifyingly attractive pure competence was. He set a tripwire, Bea announced suddenly, her voice slicing through the silence. She leaned closer to the middle monitor, a biometric lock tied to Apex Holdings' main server. If I try to wire the money out now, it triggers an alert directly to Leo's phone, and the FBI's Financial Crimes Division gets pinged. "Can you bypass it?" Lorenzo asked, his heart rate spiking. "I can't hack a biometric lock," Bea said, her brow furrowing. "But I don't have to. I'm an auditor. I know how to use the tax code against them." Her fingers flew faster. "I'm not going to wire the money. I'm going to initiate a hostile corporate merger. I'm creating a ghost shell company right now, Gallagher Listics. I'm drafting a digital contract that states your 70 shell companies are defaulting on a massive phantom debt to my new company. I'm going to legally seize the $150 million as corporate collateral." Lorenzo stared at her, utterly stunned. You're legally stealing my money to save it." Amount meinen, mein denkt, shut back, at, boom, It bypasses the biometric alarm because the system registers it as an automated corporate debt collection, not a manual withdrawal, Bea explained, a triumphant smile finally breaking across her face. She hit the enter key with a decisive smack. Checkmate, Leo. The screens flashed green. Transfer initiated, Bea breathed, leaning back in her chair, a sheen of sweat on her forehead. 30 million routed to an untraceable Swiss account in my name. 120 million routed to a newly established crypto wallet. Unprinting the physical access keys for you now. Lorenzo let out a long, shuddering breath. You did it. You actually did it. I told you, Bea said, turning her chair to face him, holding up a small USB drive. I'm not a melted candle. Before Lorenzo could respond, the heavy wooden door of Bea's apartment splintered. A silenced gunshot hissed through the air, shattering the monitor directly behind Bea's head. Sparks showered over the desk. Bea screamed, diving to the floor. Get down, Lorenzo roared. Adrenaline flooded his system, banishing the pain. He scooped up his discarded pistol from the floor and fired 2 blind shots through the splintered wood of the door. A man cursed in Italian on the other side. Leo's men had found them. Fire escape. Now! Lorenzo shouted, grabbing the USB drive from Bea's trembling hand and shoving it into his pocket. Bea didn't argue. The terrifying reality of Lorenzo's world had violently breached her sanctuary. She grabbed her keys, her encrypted backup drive, and threw her heavy winter coat over her shoulders. She scrambled through the shattered kitchen window out onto the rusted iron fire escape, the freezing Chicago rain instantly soaking her to the bone. Lorenzo followed, returning fire into the apartment as 3 heavily armed men dressed in black tactical gear burst through the ruined front door. He hit one in the shoulder, buying them a crucial 3 seconds. Move, Beatrice. Down. But. He yelled over the thunder. Despite her size, Bea moved with sheer, panicked agility, sliding down the wet iron stairs. They hit the alleyway just as bullets started pinging against the metal above them. My car. Bea pointed to a modest beige sedan parked near the dumpsters. It's old. It doesn't have GPS tracking. They scrambled into the car. Bea jammed the key into the ignition, the engine sputtering before roaring to life. Lorenzo slumped into the passenger seat, his gun trained on the alleyway. Drive, he commanded. Bea slammed the car into reverse, spinning the wheel, and gunned it out of the alley, tires squealing against the wet asphalt. She merged recklessly onto the Eisenhower Expressway, blending into the late-night trucker traffic. Her hands were shaking so violently against the steering wheel that the car drifted between lanes. She was hyperventilating, tears mixing with the rain on her face. Breathe, Beatrice, Lorenzo said softly, a stark contrast to the violence they had just escaped. He reached over, his large, blood-stained hand covering hers on the gearshift. The warmth and weight of his touch sent an unexpected jolt through her system. You did, perfectly. We're clear. They don't know this car. My apartment, Bea sobbed, the shock setting in. My life, it's gone. I can't go back there. You have $30 million, Lorenzo reminded her, his voice steadying her. You can buy 100 apartments. But right now, we need to get off the grid. The feds and Leo's men will be scanning traffic cameras. Do you know a place? Bea swallowed hard, forcing her accountant brain to override her panic. She thought of the countless audits she had run. Yes, she said, her voice trembling but finding its footing. An old paper mill on the south side. Apex Holdings bought it 3 years ago but never developed it. It's off the books. No power, but it has a roof, and it's secure. Take us there. An hour later, they were hidden deep within the cavernous, pitch-black interior of the abandoned mill. Bea had parked the car out of sight behind the rusted shipping container. Inside an old foreman's office, she lit a single camping lantern she had grabbed from her trunk. The pale light illuminated Lorenzo. He looked terrible. The adrenaline crash had hit him hard. He was slumped against the concrete wall, his skin ashen, shivering violently. His makeshift bandage was soaked through with fresh blood. Bea sighed. She couldn't let him die. Not when she was now an accessory to his crimes. She grabbed the first aid kit she had managed to bring from the car and knelt beside him. "Take the coat off," she ordered quietly. Lorenzo lacked the strength to argue. He let her help him strip off the ruined jacket and his bloodied shirt. His torso was a map of muscle, scars, and fresh, angry wounds. Bea swallowed nervously, trying to ignore the hyper-masculine proximity of the man she was treating. She cleaned the knife slash across his ribs with an antiseptic wipe. Lorenzo hissed in pain, his hand instinctively gripping her wrist. His grip was tight, but not bruising. He looked up at her, their faces inches apart in the dim lantern light. "I owe you an apology," Lorenzo whispered, his voice raspy. Bea kept her eyes focused on his wound, applying a steri-strip. "You owe me $30 million. The apology was a bonus. Look at me, Beatrice." The command was soft, but it carried the weight of the man used to being obeyed. Bea slowly raised her eyes to meet his. The dark, arrogant amusement she remembered from the Obsidian Club was entirely gone. In its place was raw, unfiltered sincerity. "I was a fool," Lorenzo said, his thumb gently brushing against the inside of her wrist. "A shallow, arrogant fool. I built my life around people who looked perfect on the outside but were entirely hollow inside. I looked at you and I judged you by the pathetic metrics of my world. I laughed at the only woman with the intelligence, the bravery, and the integrity to save me." Bea felt a lump form in her throat. She had built walls of armor around herself for years, deflecting insults and ignoring the sting of rejection. But she had no defense against genuine, repentant vulnerability. "I'm sorry, Beatrice," he continued, his gaze dropping to her lips before returning to her eyes. "Not just because I need you, but because you didn't deserve it. You are magnificent, and you are beautiful." A hot flush spread across Bea's chest. "You're delirious from blood loss, Mr. Moretti." "Lorenzo," he corrected softly. "Call me Lorenzo, and I am entirely lucid." He lifted his hand, his knuckles lightly grazing the soft curve of her cheek. Bea's breath hitched. She should pull away. He was a criminal, a murderer, the man who had humiliated her. But as she looked into his dark, intense eyes, she saw the shift. The power dynamic had leveled. They were no longer the Mafia king and the fat accountant. They were two survivors in the dark, bound by a dangerous secret and an undeniable crackling tension. "We need a plan, Lorenzo," Bea whispered, her voice betraying a slight tremble as she leaned marginally into his touch. "We have money, and we have your brains," Lorenzo said, a dangerous, predatory smile finally returning to his lips. "Tomorrow we buy a ghost crew. Tomorrow we start taking my city back. And Leo Rossi is going to learn exactly what happens when you underestimate Beatrice Gallagher." The abandoned Southside paper mill transformed into a fortress over the next 48 hours. Using a portion of her newly acquired $30 million, Bea ordered a staggering array of hardware through a proxy buyer, a Starlink satellite terminal, 4 encrypted server racks, and high-yield localized generators. Lorenzo used his share to buy muscle. He didn't go to the local families. They were all compromised by Victor Castelli or bought off by Leo. Instead, he reached out to a private military contractor group based out of Gary, Indiana. Ex-special forces operators who didn't care about mafia politics, only wire transfers. Led by a stoic, scarred man named Kalen, the team of 8 arrived in unmarked black Suburbans, armed with suppressed Sig Sauer MCX rifles and wearing unmarked Cry precision tactical gear. They looked at Lorenzo with professional indifference, but they looked at Bea with absolute bewilderment. Here was the ghost of the Chicago underworld, taking orders from a woman in a heavy, oversized cardigan who was currently stress-eating a box of glazed donuts while typing furiously on 3 keyboards. "What's the play, boss?" Kalen asked Lorenzo, dropping a duffel bag of munitions on the concrete floor. "You don't ask me," Lorenzo said, nodding toward the glow of the monitors. "You ask the architect, Bea wiped a crumb from her lip and spun her chair around. She felt a surge of terrifying, exhilarating power. She wasn't hiding behind a cubicle wall at Sterling and Hayes anymore. She was commanding an army. "Leo Rossi is bleeding," Bea announced to the room of hardened mercenaries. He thought he inherited Lorenzo's empire, but he only inherited the shell. "I seized his liquid assets. Right now, he has thousands of men on his payroll, a cartel breathing down his neck, and no cash to pay them. When criminals don't get paid, they panic. We are going to accelerate that panic." She pulled up a digital map of Chicago on the main projector screen. "Leo's legitimate front is a commercial real estate firm, Horizon Group," Bea explained, pointing a laser pen at a high-rise on Wacker Drive. "Tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., I am going to dump $30 million into short-selling Horizon stock through offshore proxy accounts. I've also drafted anonymous tips to the SEC and FinCEN, complete with internal ledgers proving Horizon is falsifying its revenue." "A margin call," Lorenzo said, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "Exactly," Bea nodded. "By noon, Horizon's stock will plummet. The banks will freeze their lines of credit. Leo won't be able to wire a single dollar digitally, which means he has to rely on physical reserves to pay Victor Castelli and the corrupt FBI agents keeping him out of prison." "Where are the physical reserves?" Colleen asked, stepping closer to the map. "First Fidelity Bank on Nassau," Bea said. "Safety deposit boxes 400 through 450. It's an old-school vault. Leo has roughly 50 million in bearer bonds, uncut diamonds, and Swiss gold francs sitting in the dark. He's going to panic and try to move it to a private airstrip before the feds raid the bank. Now, he'll use armored transport," Lorenzo stated, his eyes dark with anticipation. "Probably Aegis security, they're on his payroll." "Then we hit the transport," Kalen said, racking the bolts of his rifle. "No," Bea interrupted softly. The men all turned to her. "We don't hit the transport. We let him load it. We hit him where he feels the safest. He's flying it out of Midway International Hangar 4. It's owned by a shell company under his wife's maiden name. We take it on the tarmac." The next day, Chicago descended into financial chaos. By 11:30 a.m., CNBC was running breaking news alerts about the sudden catastrophic collapse of Horizon Group. Federal agents were seen swarming the lobby of the Wacker Drive high-rise. Inside the mobile command center, a retrofitted matte black surveillance van parked 2 miles from Midway Airport. Bea watched the satellite feeds. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, but her hands were perfectly steady. She had orchestrated the downfall of a billionaire in less than 6 hours. "He's moving," Bea said into her headset. 2 Aegis armored trucks just left LaSalle, flanked by 3 black SUVs. "He's heading south on I-55 toward Midway. ETA 20 minutes. "Copy that, Beatrice." Lorenzo's voice crackled through the earpiece. He was in the back of Kylan's lead strike vehicle, dressed in black tactical gear, his injured ribs heavily taped and pumped full of painkillers. "Are the hangar doors unsecured?" "Locked." "I've hacked the localized network for Hangar 4, Bea confirmed, her fingers dancing over the keys. "I control the blast doors, the fire suppression system, and the CCTV. I am your guardian angel today, Lorenzo. Do not miss. I never miss when I have you watching over me," he replied, his voice dropping an octave, sending a sudden electric shiver down Bea's spine. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the sprawling, oil-stained tarmac of Midway International Airport slick and highly reflective under the harsh amber glow of the perimeter floodlights. Inside the cavernous belly of Hangar 4, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. A pristine white Gulfstream 650ER private jet sat fueled and waiting 2 miles away, tucked into the shadow of an abandoned industrial park off Cicero Avenue. Beatrice Gallagher sat inside the retrofitted matte black surveillance van. The air inside smelled of ozone, overheated processors, and stale adrenaline. 3 monitors illuminated her face in a pale blue light. Her fingers flew across her mechanical keyboard with the terrifying speed of a virtuoso pianist. She had already bypassed the airport's archaic exterior security firewall and was currently dismantling the localized SCADA control systems for Hangar 4. "They're inside," Bea's voice clipped through the encrypted radio frequency, crystal clear in the earpieces of the strike team. 6 heavily armed guards. Leo is pacing near the landing gear. Victor Castelli is supervising the load. "You have a 3-minute window before the tower registers my phantom holding pattern for the aircraft." Inside the hangar, the heavy steel doors groaned shut, sealing the cartel and the traitor inside. Leo Rossi was sweating profusely, his bespoke Brioni suit clinging awkwardly to his shoulders. He clutched a reinforced titanium briefcase tight against his chest. Beside him, Victor Castelli took a slow drag from a Cuban cigar, his massive, bear-like frame casting a long shadow over the pallets of Swiss gold francs and untraceable bearer bonds. "This is a tohu disaster, Leo," Castelli rumbled, his thick Russian-Italian accent heavy with disgust. He gestured to his men who were frantically tossing the heavy steel crates into the cargo hold of the Gulfstream. "You promised me a seamless corporate transition. Instead, you're scuttling around like a cornered rat, running from the SEC margin calls." "It's a temporary, localized liquidity issue, Victor," Leo lied through his teeth, wiping his forehead with a trembling hand. "Once we land in Bogota, I'll restructure the offshore routing numbers. The money is entirely safe." "The money," a voice echoed from the steel catwalk high above them, "was never yours to begin with, Leo." Leo froze, the blood draining completely from his face. Castelli immediately dropped his cigar, his hand dropping to the heavy Desert Eagle holstered at his hip. From the surveillance van, Bea hit the enter key. Lights out. The hangar's massive overhead halogen lights violently short-circuited with a deafening pop, plunged into sudden pitch-black darkness. Castelli's men shouted in confusion, their flashlights frantically cutting through the gloom. 10 seconds later, Bea triggered the emergency protocol. The backup lights flickered to life, casting the entire hangar in a sinister, blood-red hue. Lorenzo Moretti stepped out from the deep shadows of the jet's massive landing gear, dual-suppressed H&K Mk-23 pistols raised and perfectly steady. Simultaneously, around the perimeter of the hangar, Kalen's elite mercenaries rappelled silently from the ventilation shafts. The laser sights of their rifles cut through the dim red air, painting perfect crimson dots across the chests and foreheads of Castelli's heavily armed guards. "Lorenzo," Leo whispered, his voice cracking, his eyes wide with a terror so profound his knees physically buckled. "How did you— The feds have your face on every camera." "You forgot the golden rule of this business, Leo," Lorenzo said, his voice a low, lethal purr as he walked slowly toward his former brother-in-arms. "You never, ever piss off the accountant." In the van, Bar's hands were a blur. "Systems locked. I am overriding their localized comms now. You're a ghost, Lorenzo. Execute." Gunfire erupted, shattering the tense silence. Castelli's men, hardened cartel killers who had survived the streets of Moscow and Juarez, didn't surrender. They opened fire on the catwalks. The hangar instantly transformed into a deafening echo chamber of automatic weapons and shattering aviation glass. Lorenzo moved with terrifying, lethal grace, completely ignoring the burning, tearing pain in his freshly stitched ribs. He dropped 2 of Castelli's men with precise double-tap headshots, sliding behind a heavy steel forklift as armor-piercing rounds sparked wildly against the metal. Kalen's team was surgical. They utilized flashbangs and coordinated flanking maneuvers, neutralizing the cartel threat in a matter of 80 seconds, but Castelli himself was a human tank. Roaring in fury, the massive mobster charged Lorenzo, tacking him directly through a stack of wooden pallets. The 2 men crashed onto the unforgiving concrete, engaging in a brutal hand-to-hand brawl. Castelli threw a devastating right hook that cracked against Lorenzo's jaw, But Lorenzo used the larger man's momentum against him, driving a vicious knee into Castelli's liver before wrapping a heavy steel chain from a nearby winch around the Russian's throat. Seeing his entire empire turning to ash and blood before his eyes, Leo Rossi panicked. He dropped his pride, gripped the titanium briefcase of bonds, and bolted blindly for the eastern emergency exit door. "Bay," Lorenzo grunted over the comms, his muscles straining as he choked out the massive cartel boss. "Leo's making a run for the east door. Do not let him out." Bay didn't even blink. Her eyes darted across the schematics on her right monitor. "Not today, Leo," she typed furiously, bypassing the hangar's environmental safety protocols. She targeted the automated aviation fire suppression system directly above the eastern exit corridor. Just as Leo reached his hand out to slam the crash bar of the exit door, a massive explosive blast of high-pressure chemical retardant foam erupted from the ceiling. It slammed into Leo with the force of a tidal wave. He screamed, completely blinded, his dress shoes slipping violently on the slick concrete. He crashed hard into the reinforced steel door, the briefcase flying from his hands and skittering across the floor. Back in the center of the hangar, Lorenzo tightened the chain. Castelli gagged, his face turning purple, before finally tapping the concrete floor in frantic submission. Lorenzo didn't let go immediately. He waited until Castelli's eyes rolled back, dropping the unconscious giant to the floor. Lorenzo stood up, spitting a glob of blood onto the tarmac. He limped slowly over to the eastern door. Leo was struggling to sit up, covered head to toe in freezing chemical foam, weeping openly. Lorenzo reached down, grabbed Leo by the lapels of his ruined suit, and slammed him brutally against the steel wall. "You took my home. You took my family's legacy. You dragged my name through the mud," Lorenzo hissed, pressing the hot, smoking barrel of his pistol directly under Leo's chin. "Give me one solitary reason why I shouldn't blow your brains all over this hangar door. Because you need him alive, Lorenzo." Beatrice Gallagher's voice rang out through the hangar's massive PA system. It wasn't the voice of the quiet, timid woman from the accounting firm. Her tone was absolute, calm, and echoing with terrifying authority. She was a god speaking from the clouds. Lorenzo kept the gun pressed to Leo's throat, but looked up at the closest security camera. 3 minutes ago, I successfully breached the Department of Justice's secure servers using a backdoor I embedded in Horizon Group's mainframe. Bear's voice echoed, cold and clear over the groaning of the jet engines. "I have just uploaded the unencrypted ledgers proving Leo forged your biometric signature on the terrorism funding. More importantly, I uploaded the localized audio files of Leo explicitly bribing federal agent David Harrison. It's sitting in the inbox of the director of the FBI right now." Leo sobbed, his entire body going limp in Lorenzo's grip. "If you pull that trigger, Lorenzo, you are a murderer," Bea stated, her voice softening just a fraction, speaking directly to the man she had come to care for. "If you drop him on this floor for the feds to find, you are an exonerated man. Your money is secure. The board is cleared. Take the win. It's your choice." Lorenzo stared down at the pathetic, broken man in his grip. He realized then that true power wasn't the ability to inflict violence. It was absolute control over the narrative. And Beatrice had just handed him the ultimate control. A slow, genuine smile spread across Lorenzo's bruised face. He lowered the weapon. "The FBI's SWAT teams are exactly 4 minutes out," Bea informed the crew. "Grab the gold," Lorenzo ordered Kylen, dropping Leo to the floor like a sack of garbage. "Leave the bearer bonds for the IRS. We're ghosts. Truce." 6 months later. The late afternoon sun set over the glittering sapphire waters of Lake Como, Italy. On the sprawling marble terrace of a heavily guarded, hyper-exclusive private villa, Beatrice Gallagher sat at a glass table. She wore a custom-tailored emerald green silk dress that didn't attempt to hide her curves, but rather celebrated them. She looked regal, dangerously intelligent and undeniably beautiful. She was casually sipping a vintage Barolo while reviewing the staggering quarterly earnings of Moretti Gallagher Holdings, a now entirely legitimate international logistics and private equity juggernaut. Heavy, familiar footsteps sounded on the marble behind her. Lorenzo stepped onto the terrace. He wore a crisp white linen shirt, unbuttoned at the collar, looking relaxed, tanned, and devastatingly handsome. The violent scars on his ribs were fading, but the lesson he had learned in the dark would last him a lifetime. He didn't even glance at the multi-million-dollar panoramic view of the lake. His dark eyes were fixed solely on her. He walked over, gently taking the encrypted tablet from her hand and placing it face down on the table. He leaned down, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to the sensitive skin of her neck, feeling her breath hitch before capturing her lips in a deep, consuming kiss that tasted of red wine and absolute devotion. "You work entirely too hard, mia regina, my queen," Lorenzo murmured against her lips, his large hands resting reverently on her waist. "Someone has to keep our billions clean and the SEC off our backs." Bia smiled softly, looping her arms around his neck, putting him closer to her chest. "Are our lawyers in Chicago happy?" "Ecstatic," Lorenzo said, a dark, satisfied gleam in his eyes. "Leo pleaded guilty to 80 counts of federal racketeering and treason this morning. Agent Harrison is sharing a maximum security cell block with him. The slate is entirely clean. We own the city's infrastructure, and we did it without firing a single shot since the tarmac." "I told you 6 months ago," Bia teased, running a manicured hand through his thick, dark hair. "Numbers are a much sharper weapon than bullets, Lorenzo." "I know," he whispered, his gaze dropping to her lips, burning with a fierce, unwavering loyalty that he had never shown to another living soul. "I laughed at the most dangerous woman in the world once. I was a blind, arrogant fool. I will happily spend the rest of my life making up for it." He kissed her again, knowing exactly who held the true power in this empire. The king was finally back on his throne, but he would gladly bow every single day to the brilliant queen who had put him there. Whoa, did you see that ending coming? Lorenzo went from mocking Bia to literally laying his entire empire at her feet. It just goes to show you never ever underestimate a woman with brains, especially when she's holding your bank accounts hostage. The dynamic between them completely flipped, and seeing the fat girl not only win but become the most powerful player in the room is the exact kind of karma we love to see. If you love this story of mafia betrayal, high-stakes revenge, and a romance that broke all the toxic rules, smash that like button right now. Drop a comment below. Would you have taken the 30 million and ran, or stayed to build an empire? Don't forget to share this video with your fellow drama lovers, and hit subscribe for more intense, twist-filled romance stories every single week.